Welcome to Race and Diplomacy. My name is Judd Devermont.
I'm Travis Adkins, and this video series is where we talk about the current racial reckoning in America and all the implications it has for international affairs and foreign policy.
We want to engage U.S., African, and global activists, journalists, educators, diplomats, and of course you. We want to talk about how we change mindsets, processes, and practices, both at home and abroad.
In today's episode, we'd like to welcome Ambassador Alberto Fernandez, who's the former U.S. Ambassador to Equatorial Guinea and our Charge d'Affaires to Sudan. Also, Jitu Sardar, the Deputy Director of East Africa at the Department of State, as well as Liz Liu, the Special Coordinator for the Young African Leaders Initiative, YALI, about their experiences as Cuban-American and Asian American diplomats working in Africa and on African issues. And so, why Africa? You know, what was it about your life, your career, your journey, your educational backgrounds that made you decide that the Africa Bureau at State was the best for you, and that serving in an embassy on the African continent was the direction that you wanted to go in?
So I don't know if I chose Africa or Africa chose me, because my first tour was actually in the Bureau of African Affairs in the public diplomacy office. I think I ended up there because I'm public diplomacy coned, and it was a public diplomacy job. But little did I know that that's just the experience that I needed, because while many of my colleagues were off doing maybe 2 tours of consular work, I was getting substantive PD experience from the get-go, and that really helped propel my career forward. We like to say AF is family, and I think that's true. I also, from my first tour, knew and loved YALI from the get-go. I know it's an amazing program, and the opportunity to come back and work on it was a tremendous opportunity.
What about you, Ambassador Fernandez?
It's a great question. It's a fascinating issue, and it's a kind of a complicated answer. I would say 2 things. First, practically, I first served in Africa or on Africa without being in the Africa Bureau, because I was a public diplomacy officer, and I served half of my career in the U.S. Information Agency, USIA. And early on in my career, 1990 to 1992, I was a desk officer, and I was desk officer for Egypt, Yemen, and Sudan. Later, it was many years before I was chief of mission in Sudan. But more broadly, Africa always had a fascination for me, more personally, because Cuban culture, our common Cuban culture that we as the Cuban Americans have, is deeply, deeply connected to Africa. Whether you're black, white, mulatto, whatever, however you see yourself as a Cuban American, our culture is deeply Afro-Cuban.
G2.
I do think my entry into Africa and working on the continent was very much accidental in some respects. Throughout my undergraduate and graduate studies, I'd focused very much on South Asia, being of Indian heritage, and I think really understanding that context more and wanting to be interested and work on those issues. But when I joined the State Department, you get a list of posts for your first or second assignment, and you have to look through them. The one that stood out for some reason was N'Djamena, Chad. And I had never known anything about Chad. I didn't actually know the context. I didn't know anything about the Sahel in particular, let alone a lot about the continent. But then after talking to some of my mentors, more senior foreign service officers, and not really knowing what I was getting into, they suggested go for it, because some of these embassies that you're working in sub-Saharan Africa give you opportunities to do really meaningful work early on in your tour, whereas in other contexts and other embassies, whether it be Beijing or Mexico City, et cetera, you wouldn't necessarily be able to do. So I took that chance. I was 25. I didn't really know what I was getting into in terms of working in the State Department, let alone working overseas. But I went there. I immediately fell in love with the environment. I was able to do very meaningful work. I was able to have sort of deep, thoughtful conversations with influencers across the board, and I was able to extend my experience in the continent out further, working in places like DRC and Central African Republic, working back here in Washington. I'm so fortunate to have had that experience for a lot of reasons, personally and professionally.
So one of the reasons why we wanted to do this particular episode is because Travis and I feel that when it comes to race, and particularly America and sub-Saharan Africa, it's almost always framed as white and black, white or black. And right, that's not a reflection of our diplomatic corps and our diversity, but even on the continent, long-standing diaspora communities that are South Asian or Chinese, or as Ambassador Fernandez said, this strong connection between Cuba and the continent. We don't have anyone here who has a Lebanese descent, but a large Lebanese diaspora community. And so I guess we wanted to hear a little bit about how have you approached what can often be a very binary conversation about Africa and race? What are the biases, unconscious or not, that you have to deal with?
Judd, I think that's a great question. I think before making a career working on African issues, I was not, I think, appreciative of the multifaceted nature of that sort of tapestry that exists there. And really only after going my first tour and then going to countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo and other places did I realize that there's a huge legacy with respect to colonialism and how that has impacted the development and formulations of these diaspora communities that you're alluding to. I felt as though in my conversations with my African interlocutors, whatever country that I was in, they were actually more appreciative of the multifaceted nature of their countries and of the continent than maybe our American domestic audiences might. In speaking with host government officials or even educators, when I would mention to them my family was from Calcutta, they would immediately talk about how they had they studied university in India, and they had friends who were from either West Bengal or Bangladesh. And clearly the dynamic nature of their backgrounds is something that I wasn't appreciative of until I got to speak with them and know them. And then I think kind of being able to understand the long nature of those diaspora communities, meeting with Indians who had lived in some of these countries for multiple generations, and seeing that they knew the African context a lot better than I think some of U.S. diplomats or even expatriates. So I think a recognition and appreciation for how multivariate that those backgrounds and contexts was something I definitely came back with. And my next tour after this will be in Mauritius, which has a completely unique context and which is actually majority Indian, but they view themselves having one foot in each door, with having an affinity with Africa along with their South Asian heritage. So I think the complexity and the richness of that is arguably something that they know, and maybe we could, I think, here benefit from sort of informing our audiences when we are talking about Africa, not making it a binary choice, as you have mentioned, or binary discussion, but one that really respects and applauds that diversity that exists there already.
Thanks. Ambassador.
No, I think that one of the blessings of being a minority in America is that you have a foot in different camps. You're part of a broader society. We're all Americans. We're all proud of America, but there are layers to your identity. And yeah, there tends to be a kind of discourse in America sometimes, which does make things very binary, where in the region, it's a little more complicated. I mean, a country like Sudan, almost everybody in Sudan is Black, but actually the issue of Sudan's identity is, are you an Arab or are you an African, And in fact, the bloody longest civil war in Africa's history, which was the Sudanese Civil War, to sum it up in one sentence, that's what it was about. So these questions of kind of ethnicity and race, how people see each other, is so important. Equatorial Guinea, the same way. This is the only Spanish-speaking country in Africa. The Equatorial Guineans saw themselves as kind of orphans. They said, there's the French group and the English group and the Arabic group, Portuguese Lusophone group, and then there are these Spanish-speaking, Spanish like Castilian Spanish, not even like Cuban Spanish, outliers who don't know where they belong. So absolutely, I think having this kind of complex background where you're part of something larger, but you're also yourself can be very empowering in a continent like Africa, which is complex. And a good diplomat is always going to kind of want to understand complex societies and look at the different layers that there are in a civilization and a society, and not see things in a simple way, but dig deeper.
So I guess from an East Asian perspective, I talked to a few colleagues ahead of this that have served in different places. And the consensus sort of is that because China has the most influence in Africa relative to other Asian countries, a lot of times when Africans see an Asian face, they think that person's Chinese. So those things happen. And I think really what we need to do, and I want to thank Travis for his contributions to this because he's working with our office on this, is think more holistically about how we tell America's story, right? If we leave out chapters, whether it's about Asian Americans, Latinx Americans, or so on, then we're not really telling our whole story. We're doing a disservice to ourselves and to foreign audiences. So we need to think more deeply about how to do that.
Thank you. When I think about kind of the unique historical and contemporary relationships of the countries and regions that you all's families of origin are from, right? And so you think about Cuba, and you think about, at one perspective, the kind of Afro influence on Cuba, as well as Cuba's anti-colonial and revolutionary history in support of African nations. Obviously, when you think of China, you think of the points that Liz just raised, but also the long history of China and Africa, not just this contemporary history that has become all the rage for us to talk about in DC policy circles. And the same, I would say, for South Asia and Indians in East Africa and the like. And what I'm curious about here is how, being of those heritages and walking in the bodies that you walk in, how have those experiences either helped or hindered you or impacted the perceptions of people that people had of you or your credibility as you go about your diplomatic engagement efforts?
I think it's been a tremendous help. I mean, it's not necessarily because of ethnicity, but it kind of is. I mean, when I arrived in Sudan, I was already well known because I was a spokesman for the department in Arabic. So earlier on, I'd done hundreds of interviews on Al Jazeera and other places. And so people would see me on the street in Sudan and they'd say, "Oh, that's Alberto Fernandez. We want our picture taken with you," you know? It was a minor celebrity. The fact that I spoke Arabic, really spoke Arabic, unlike, sadly to say, a lot of our Arabic-speaking diplomats in the Foreign Service don't really speak Arabic. That was a huge advantage in Sudan. In Equatorial Guinea, I think it was incredibly useful because they would say, "We hope this doesn't sound offensive, but you're American, and you're obviously an American ambassador, and you're American, but you're not really American." And what they meant was not a bad thing, but a good thing. What they meant is, you're simpatico. You're kind of like us. You know something about us. There's a kind of a connection that exists. And of course, that is in the work of diplomacy, so much of it, which is human connection, that's golden. That's what we all want. We want to connect with people.
How about you, Liz?
I think for me, as an Asian American this year, I was watching in horror as hate crimes against AAPIs increased dramatically in the wake of COVID. And I think that experience, as the events leading up to George Floyd's killing unfolded, made me that much more aware of the moment, and that the fight for social justice in our country for people of color, no matter what color in the United States, is never ending. And at the same time, as YALI coordinator, I spend all day, every day thinking about supporting and uplifting Black excellence. That's my job. And so that whole time period was really difficult for me, both personally and professionally. So what I did was I worked with our front office to have our assistant secretary send out a message to the YALI network of 650,000 members across the continent, expressing his feelings about the situation and calling for solidarity. And I also put together a YALI town hall that featured some alumni, a professor out of Howard, and Deputy Assistant Secretary Fitzsimmons, so we could have a conversation on the topic. And we're continuing that conversation today. So I'm really happy that I've had the chance to do that. And I'm not sure if someone in my position wasn't a person of color, if those kind of programs would have happened.
Thank you. Jitu.
Well, I would say that going back to the ambassador's point, when you are working in Africa of a minority descent as an American, whether it be South Asian in my case or other ethnic backgrounds, and as far as my colleagues go, the idea that you can somehow understand a little bit better the context really applies. And I think it goes without saying that colonialism has a very long impact and challenging impact for countries on the continent. And I think in my conversations with my African interlocutors, they would, speaking to sort of the historical context and legacies that they faced, they immediately point to the fact that, oh, your family's from India, you understand to an extent the legacy that you're dealing with. Not saying that every context was the same, but it did allow for at least some level of awareness and understanding. And I think as far as like cultural context and background go, maybe I could just sort of distill it down to one story that has been particularly memorable for me. I served for a year at the time it was our branch office in Goma in Eastern Congo. And there just happened to be an Indian restaurant there in Goma. And when I got there, the food's very good, but I did not expect it to generate any degree of popularity there. But that happened to be the epicenter of all conversations that were happening in Goma on what was taking place in terms of the intercommunal tensions, the armed conflict, the sort of political discussions. There was a large Indian peacekeeping contingent there. And that restaurant, which is called Salt and Pepper, had the ability just to bring everybody together. And every time I'd have a conversation with my Congolese counterparts and ask them, hey, we should continue this conversation, let's try to meet somewhere, they'd immediately say, we should go to that Indian restaurant, right? And I think it relates to the fact that when you do have at least a multifaceted, maybe a more multicultural background, you can relate on things. And there's no really better way to relate than with food. And I think that kind of helps out in the context as well of trying to bridge those divides, get to know one another. And I think that background does help in conversations and engagements you have.
A big part of this conversation is making the argument that it is to our advantage to have a diverse group of Americans in Africa policy, right? Getting away from that binary framing. And so I wanted to ask questions just to Jitu and to Liz about the pitch that you make to colleagues, that you make to your mentees as rising leaders about working in AF. How do we recruit and retain a more diverse workforce within the AF Bureau?
Jitu touched on the fact that there are so many great opportunities in the Africa Bureau for even entry or mid-level officers to really do substantive and meaningful work that they might not get a chance to do in other places. If you want to go into recruitment and retention, I have a couple of thoughts there to share. One is the Western Hemisphere Bureau recruited Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary Chung for two reasons. One, because she's a China hand and they needed that expertise, but also because she's known as a disruptor who could have a positive impact on their D&I efforts. I think AF should do the same accordingly when we think about our new leadership. These efforts really need to start at the top. If we want to maintain the momentum that we have in this moment, in the long run, we need to lay down structures to make people accountable and that make efforts to support diversity and inclusion not just something that's nice to do, but something that we must do. It's not other duties as assigned. It's not just something that the D&I Council that's made up predominantly of people of color work on. It's something that has high level attention. And then on recruitment, we need to be active in our recruitment. You can't be passive and just wait for people to come in. You have to demand that you have diverse slates of candidates.
I agree. Liz brought up some great thoughts and recommendations. I think when we try to recruit people to the Africa Bureau, it's really important for us to tell the story of why Africa matters to the United States. We have not told that story, and administrations have tried to prioritize it, and administrations have not been successful in that. We kind of are looking at it in the lens of how does the US interact with some of these other global powers in Africa, when the reality is our relationship with Africa in and of itself is extremely important for historical reasons, political, geopolitical, economic reasons, etc. So the more we can tell that story, coupled with, I think, what was discussed earlier about the need to sort of make an impact and the ability to make an impact early on in your career is extremely important. So I think, I look forward to working on that piece. I'm sure others do too. And we can sort of make that broader pitch across the board to a lot of our colleagues who are thinking about the Africa Bureau, but may not quite be there because they're seeing other opportunities elsewhere in the world. I think on the diversity and inclusion piece, I would argue, in addition to all the great thoughts that have already been said there, COVID has had a really big impact in terms of sort of the diversity of our workforce. And I think it comes to the fact that in this unique environment, we have in a telework setting, working parents, parents with elder care needs, with education needs, et cetera. And, I think a lot of studies are validating this. More often women than men are choosing to give up their careers because they are seeing that it's just too much of a strain on their family. We have to flip that mindset around, and we have to give space for people to address their family considerations, whether they be men or women, and make sure that they can still contribute to the workforce. We've had those conversations within the Africa Bureau. It's not extensive enough in my view, and we need to keep maybe pushing that dialogue a little bit.
So, Ambassador, I wanted to close out with a question. A lot of this conversation has been kind of about the diversity of the Foreign Service and the workforce writ large, but I'm really curious about the pipeline to senior leadership within the department. And so we know that there are now only about 5 African-American ambassadors from the United States in the world, 3 of them serving in Africa. And so while that is perhaps a historic low, at least in the contemporary sense, it is also rare for Americans of Asian or Latino descent to be ambassadors on the continent. And we know now that we have Don Yamamoto, the ambassador in Somalia, also your successor in Equatorial Guinea, Ambassador Julie Farutu-Toye. And I'm just wondering what you think accounts for this and how you think we might begin to make changes in that regard.
One of the problems, of course, is you mentioned the word pipeline, and that's absolutely true. I mean, I entered in the 1980s, and I was chosen to go to Sudan in 2006. I went to, the following year. So there's a time lag. So we always face the challenge that we're living the reality now, not of the screw ups or the challenges or the problems of right now, which we have, there are plenty, but of 20 years ago, of what wasn't done 20 years ago, of the failure to emphasize diversity, the failure to cast your net broadly 20 years ago. I mean, in my own experience, for example, I was lucky. I was recruited to go to Sudan. The PDAS in the Africa Bureau, a visionary leader named Linda Thomas Greenfield recruited me because she knew me because we'd served in the senior seminar together. So she specifically sought me out. She thought I would have been out. I would be a good fit for Sudan. And later on, I was the Bureau's candidate to be chief of mission in Malabo in Equatorial Guinea. So it is about leadership. And especially, obviously, the PDASs. Sometimes, as you know, assistant secretaries are sometimes political appointees. Sometimes they're there for other reasons. It's the kind of the senior professional leadership. It has to demonstrate that leadership. And it's kind of leadership with creativity, kind of looking broadly, thinking strategically. So you need good leaders to kind of do that, or otherwise you're stuck with whatever happened in the past and you're trying to make the best of it.